Right in, right in. Okay. I think we are in fact live right now, and we have to tell the people that are now with us. We were having a delightful conversation about how Mel Brooks' Blazing Saddles might in fact be the movie for the moment in a great many ways. But anyway, Allison, how you doing today?
Right in, right in. Okay.
I'm good.
Good.
Sorry. That's how I am today.
Was that your echo we heard?
Quite possibly. Yeah, it is. It's been an interesting week, I think, for everybody.
Yeah, yeah. So what's most interesting about it for you?
Honestly, not that much. I mean, I've kind of tried to limit the number of times that I check the news per day, because otherwise I will fall down a hole and, 3 hours later realize I was supposed to be doing anything.
Right.
And I mean, I think at some point you kind of just hit information overload. So honestly, this week I've been trying to take it a little easier on the news. This is probably a bad week to take it easier on the news. But I'm trying.
I was going to say, how is it possible to take it easy on news this week?
What I do is I'll open up that. I open up Google News, right? Like, the page, and it has, 20, 30 stories or whatever. And if I go through all of those and I click on the ones I want to click on, and then that's it. I can't keep clicking through, because then I will take hours. So it's just, this is what the page gave me. These are the stories I'm going to read right now, and I'll come back later and try it again.
Yeah.
So,
but I mean, it's just such a bizarre moment in the middle of the pandemic is now below the fold, which is a little bizarre to say that we are in the middle of the great pandemic of the last century, and we're trying to open up, and numbers are starting to go back up again, and all of that stuff to talk about. That we'll talk about some of that today. But then at the same time, to have major social upheaval around this issue, to have a president declaring essentially or threatening to essentially declare martial law. I mean, I was talking to a friend, and he said, okay, now all we need is about a magnitude 8.5 in Southern California. It's magnitude, category 5 hurricane to slam into Georgia or something. Where does it go from here? Anyway, how you doing, Dave?
I'm doing well. It's a very calm, very quiet week here.
That's not what you were saying before.
I was going to say
here, very specifically, right here.
There was no reaction to that? Okay. I'm glad that everything is so down to earth and absolutely normal this week.
Yeah.
Actually, Waukesha at least has been quiet.
What's that?
Waukesha at least has been quiet. The marches and everything remained peaceful, and
That's right. And Seattle, I think, and LA, I think the curfews are going to be lifted tonight, and the expectation is there will be peaceful protesting. And we can remind ourselves, of course, that the United States of America began with a series of protests. Our country did. Yeah. So, but it's a very strange time, as you say, and we did have, it wasn't a huge earthquake. We did have a little earthquake in California yesterday. And we did have a little tornado outside of Philadelphia too. So
really?
The government is collapsing in part.
Yeah.
There's the worst pandemic since World War I is going on. We have incredible social upheaval driven by justifiable events and 400 years of injustice since the first slaves landed near Jamestown in 1619. And then we have a tornado and an earthquake too on top of it. So, it's been a rather crazy week, and it's been a good one in terms of getting things done for Astronomy Magazine and for our products. But we certainly have a lot to talk about in this big world. And I think this is a real moment of change. And this younger generation is going to drive this change. The youngest generation, I think, is going to really make, in some ways, the United States of America ultimately what it should have been to begin with. And
although one of the things that I've noticed is that if you look at protesters,
Yeah.
You see people of all ages, of all ethnicities. And so, I think for a very long time, once upon a time you thought of, well, okay, there's a race riot and it is actually divided along ethnic grounds.
Mm-hmm.
This one isn't that way. And I think I think there are a lot of people. I think there are a lot of white folks who for a long time have kind of wondered, all right, I'm aware of the issue, but at the same time, I don't know how to be active around the issue, really, that are sort of finding this as enabling in a sense. And so it is really, the images that I have found really spectacular are images of just completely, multi-ethnic, multi-generational protesters out protesting this. The same kinds of groups out, cleaning up and so on and so forth. Groups with the cops taking a knee is sort of a remarkable thing. And I mean, it's not like they suddenly become, oh, we're the good guys now, but it's showing real honest to goodness awareness.
That's right. Yeah.
And then at the same time, you still have a picture popped up the other day of a protester there with his little, maybe 3 or 4 year old daughter sitting on his shoulders, and a cop sitting there with a gun, getting ready to, looking like he's about ready to shoot a canister of tear gas at him. And so the juxtaposition of those images is just bizarre.
It's incredible. And you're right. I mean, we were young at the time, but Allison wasn't here yet. But the protests in the 60s were really along racial lines for the most part. You didn't see this incredible diversity. Now you're seeing protests that are largely driven by a young generation, but it's a multicultural, diverse group of people in that generation who have had it with this.
Yeah.
Because Thomas Jefferson, when he was in Jacob Groff's boarding house the week of June 16th, 1770.
Allison, does it disturb you as much as it disturbs me that he can roll off information like that?
We all have our niches, right?
When he wrote that all men are created equal in the evening, when he wasn't there at the Constitutional Convention during the day, when in the spare time of his evening hours, he wrote the Declaration of Independence over 4 nights, which is a pretty impressive feat.
Yeah.
He wrote all men are created equal. And what he meant is all Americans are created equal. And he didn't mean that, because he himself, of course, was a slaveholder.
Yeah.
He understood.
I was going to say, but some were only 2/5 as equal as others.
That's right.
Yeah.
But he was not making a statement about what this proto-nation was. He was making a statement about what it should be.
Right.
And it's gone through the original injustice of slavery from 1619 onward. It's gone through the Civil War. It's gone through the civil rights struggles of the 1960s and Dr. King. It's gone through the presidency of Barack Obama.
Yeah.
Each of those events crying out for real, true justice and equality. And, equal rights under law ought to be a reality and not just something that's engraved into a building across from the Capitol.
Boy, but we are right there on a razor's edge right now, because on the one hand, there's a lot of positive stuff going on. And on the other hand, I was reading an article sort of talking about all of the various ways that Republicans are thinking about how they might be able to keep Trump in office even if he loses the election. And so we're at this moment of people are gonna, volumes and volumes and volumes and volumes are going to be written about the year 2020.
That's right.
And at least I hope they will. I hope that people will still have the freedom to write those volumes.
I'm sure it will be, in essence, an analogous year to what 1968 was in that epoch, although it was different, of course.
Anyway.
But this, I think, will have real change, because older folks who don't want to change their ways or admit maybe that change is inevitable may not alter their views on things. But this young generation has had it. They don't want this kind of bullshit and inequality, and they want medical care, and they want help with education, and they have had it. And so this country is going to, I think, shake off some of those original sins that have taken more than 2 centuries now to try to address more seriously. It's an amazing time.
Yeah. I mean, Allison, I'm curious from your perspective. Here, you've got a couple of old white guys talking about what's going on with the younger generation.
Right.
Well, in fact, we have Allison sitting there. So we are almost being stereotypical, Dave. Somewhere out there right now, someone is screaming mansplaining. So anyway, Allison, what, from your perspective, from your generation's perspective, what has all of this looked like? What does it look like?
I mean, I think a lot of it looks like, to me anyway, I think a lot of the resistance to change is kind of almost the same thing I've seen in, say, academia, where it's like, well, I had to do it this way, so you have to do it this way. It was hard for me, so it's got to be hard for you, or you're never going to learn. And I think that has kind of fueled some of the older generation's resistance to this change, perhaps. Again, I'm not part of the older generation, I can't say, but it seems to me that's kind of the case. The idea that, well, it worked just fine before, and just fine is clearly relative, but I think it worked just fine for a lot of privileged people. And so why should we change? And the answer is not everybody's privileged, that's why. I mean, to me, again, and I don't know if this is just a factor of where I grew up or my family or whatever, I grew up in, there was never a question of like, is someone who's black or white better? Or, there was, I guess it was never an issue for me. I think in a lot of this younger generation, I think, to maybe the older generation's credit, a lot of things have changed. A lot of the younger generation is not seeing race, is not seeing gender, is not seeing sexuality, things like that. I mean, because all of these previous revolutions have happened. And so now we're kind of at a breaking point where it's like, well, if this is what you've taught me my whole life, then why is it still a problem? So in a way, I think, it's kind of, there needs to be a change. There needs to be this kind of revolution that's building on these, past revolutions of civil rights and, gay rights and all of these other things that have happened before. It's kind of almost a logical next step. And, again, the administration currently in place is the kind of administration that says, well, things have been fine before, so why should we change them? But the rest of the country, or at least large portions of the country, the younger generation doesn't believe that.
No, let's be honest. The current administration is not saying things have been okay the way they were before. The current administration is saying, I really like the idea of being a tin pot dictator. That's what the current administration.
I like having money and I like having power, and why should anybody else take that away from me?
Yeah.
I think that hopefully the idea is that is not how it works. That's why there are, going back to my high school, classes, there are checks and balances hopefully for a reason. And one of those checks and balances is elections. So that's the idea.
Yeah. In fact, I yesterday was listening, and George Floyd's brother was talking to a group, and he went there. He said, "Look, we can't get lazy, and that the place that this has to come out is you got to vote. You got to get involved at that level." And hearing people at the very center of this, recognizing and speaking out on, no, this is something that we have to change as a society. And to change it as a society means that we actually have to worry about those kinds of institutions. And in a funny way, I mean, we may wind up having Trump to thank for that change.
Right.
Because when you've almost got a caricature, well, not almost, when you do have a caricature of the negative that we're talking about here in the White House, doing things like threatening to declare martial law and then having a bunch of peaceful protesters gassed and beaten up so that he can do just a completely, I don't even know the word for that photo op. You know,
I think it's beyond words. The picture is worth 1,000 words anyway, but yeah.
Oh, I think that one's worth a fair few more. And then the rats are starting to leave the sinking ship. You know, Murkowski, way too little, way too late, I guess, has decided that she can't quite stick with Trump. Pat Robertson actually came out and said that this was too far. And it's like, Pat Robertson said that? I mean, I don't believe for an instant that he's sincere about it, but I think that what that says is he realizes that maybe they have their cart attached to the wrong horse. And oh my, if that crowd decides that Trump is a bridge too far. Anyway.
No, I mean, I think human society tends to be, I mean, the way that we deal with things a lot of times is things have to get really bad before we realize that they're bad and then do something about them. And maybe that is the case here.
Yeah. Okay, speaking of really bad, that actually is maybe a good place for a segue. How's COVID doing?
Well, COVID itself is doing great, but
doing better than it ever has as a disease before.
Yeah. It's kind of like I hope that everybody enjoyed their Memorial Day as much as COVID did.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, again, I think it comes back to what we said last week, whereas nothing has changed from, you know, a disease standpoint. Everything is exactly the same. And so it's kind of that same idea where we can't get lazy. We can't, just decide, well, it's been a couple months and we're all sick of being inside. So I guess that's that. That's not going to be how it works.
Well, but how do we, I mean, it's kind of funny because, it's been a whole 2 days since we put together the blurb about, okay, this is what we're going to talk about today. And as is often the case, events have thrown us off that by a bunch. But, there's the federal response to COVID has simply
disappeared,
evaporated,
right? Yeah.
Fauci says that he's not talking to anybody anymore. I forget his name, but the general who was nominally supposed to be heading the testing effort resigned. So the federal response is now non-existent at a time when numbers are turning back up. It's there is all sorts of data, and we repeat this, but there's all sorts of data that says that maybe 4% of the population has had this thing at this point. And that comes from both testing and also analysis of the way that the pandemic has played out, the numbers. People are still talking about maybe 80%, 70, 80% is what it's going to take for herd immunity. Which means that we've got 107,000 people dead, and we're only 5% of the way into this. And people are imagining that it's behind us. So where does it go from here? What does the path look like?
Well, I think I saw that Arizona had its worst last few days of new cases just over the last few days, and now there are these different institutional models from MIT to NIH to everyone else that are looking at estimates now of, I believe, of 125 to 150,000 or more dead by the end of June. I mean, that's a huge increase just in the next essentially month, a little less than a month. That's pretty frightful that the numbers are going to continue to ramp up dramatically. And I see a complete behavioral change of many people around here, as if normal life has been granted to them and dropped straight down out of the sky like the house that hit the Wicked Witch of the West, and they're back to normal. And going into a grocery store now, even, a fancy pants grocery store, I would say less than half of the people I saw this last weekend had a mask on. So things are going to continue to get bad, and there's going to have to be an individual realization on single human beings' points of view in order to get this through their head that it's still around and serious.
Yeah, and I think, especially, I guess for me, it's kind of been a reminder of, so what if I'm the only person in the grocery store wearing a mask? It's still the right thing to do. And I think people need to kind of keep that in mind, because it is very easy to give in to pressure when you know that you're going to go to the store and half the people or few are not going to be wearing masks. And again, you can't get lazy.
Except the sad thing there is that you're not wearing a mask for you.
Right, you're not. You're wearing it for other people. I think the problem is that people, and I fall into this too, you want to believe that if you're wearing a mask, you're maybe just a little bit better off. And the answer is maybe you're just a little bit better off, but it's not, people want to think it's a magic bullet, it's a shield, and it's not.
No, again, viruses are what we term scientifically very small. So wearing a piece of cloth around your mouth and nose doesn't block viruses that are 1/200th the width of a human hair, but it does help, and especially with droplets that are dispensed from coughing or sneezing. But it is by no means a magic bullet or full protection, and there's certainly going to be a hell of a game of Russian roulette going on. And it kind of, it reminds me, not in a political sense, but many, many people are conservative in the way they think, not politically, but if they've done something a certain way in their life, they stick with it forever. And some of this problem with resisting change,
except social distancing.
If they don't stick with that long enough, they're not around forever.
They don't stick with that forever. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, but again, it kind of comes down to Americans too, because, I've had friends that grew up in Japan, and for example, and, she always would wear a mask even when she came back here if she was sick. And she, it just baffled her as to why no one else did. So, again, hopefully, again, maybe it's too little too late, but those kinds of things could become ingrained, and that would help, but,
Do you think that if there's a second wave, and again, there are another 50,000 casualties in the next 30 or 45 days, will this kind of will people kind of take it more seriously if there's another wave of this again?
What do you mean second wave?
Well, a continuance
to have a second wave, doesn't the first wave actually have to end?
Right.
I think the question would be is if lockdowns, say, ensue again, would that, I think that's what it's going to take for people to take it seriously. And if lockdowns never happen again, if people don't get furloughed or laid off again, then no, I think it's still going to be very hard for people who it hasn't touched to take seriously.
They're just going to go right out, and when they eventually get hit with a virus particle, a density of virus particles that's high enough, or a rubber bullet, being an innocent protester, they're going to have to pay the price from this system that we have now here.
Yeah. And there are going to be a fair few people who are hit by rubber bullets and COVID, unfortunately.
Yeah, I know that they were even just saying there was, I think, an Austin protest where several protesters had tested positive.
Yeah. Well, of course they are. You get thousands of people together, and there are going to be a bunch of them that are positive. And those are numbers that are scary. We're still not the extraordinary thing is that this far into it, we still aren't exactly sure of things like how contagious it can be, and all of those kinds of numbers.
How it even kills you is still very.
How it even kills you is still.
And all of the nasty things it does in your circulatory system, let alone in the lungs and kidneys, and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. I was, a column I gave you last month's column, I guess, I was talking about, what is the progression of this thing? And that's even going to be a period piece, because we've learned yeah, this is the way that we thought it progressed, but now we've learned it does all sorts of other nasty stuff as well.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, how people are going to behave. We promised to talk about public health aspects of this thing. And right now, as we open up and pretend that it's okay, everything is down to how people behave.
Mm-hmm.
And there are actually data about that of a sort that we've never had before. Cell phones, for example, you can actually, and no, nobody's spying on you well, no, everybody's spying on you.
They're not listening to your phone calls. Probably.
Right. But in this particular context, it's not like everybody's spying on you, that they're taking anonymized data about how people move, which actually lets them look at mobility. And it's really fascinating, because if you look at it, as this thing hit and as, lockdowns and such were imposed, the mobility just went boom. Mm-hmm. And since that time, the mobility has been climbing slowly. And it's, it amazingly enough, when we said, okay, we're going to open now, the mobility didn't jump up at that point, but it did continue to slowly rise. So I think that at the numbers that I've seen is that maybe at peak impact, overall mobility in the US was down by a third or something, down at maybe minus 35% or some such. And now it's still suppressed. It's down at like maybe 10%. And as that happens, you're starting to see the cases come back up. You're starting to see the deaths come back up. Again, when you subtract kind of New York and New Jersey and what's the other one? I mean, there are kind of three big ones. Anyway, you subtract them out of it, they're actually showing some serious downturn. Mm-hmm. Here we go. And it really is kind of fascinating to just be able to sit there, and if you take the time to look at the data, and it's just, from the perspective of a scientist who enjoys staring at data, and let's face it, we are weird folk, we just are in that respect. It's fascinating, and the data that you have, you look at it, and it's just like, okay, it's doing what it's doing. It's doing what you imagined it was going to do. It's mm-hmm. going to do what you imagine it's going to do. Mm-hmm. And the one thing that you don't know is how we're going to respond. Like you were talking about the models. 538 talked about the models.
Yeah.
Did you actually read the assumptions that those models were making about mitigations?
No.
If you read the assumptions that those models are making about mitigations, they are all very optimistic. They tend to make assumptions like if a mitigation is in place at the time that we ran this model, then we will assume that it's there, or that it remains in place or whatever. Mm-hmm. None of those models were just throwing the door open and saying, okay, let's imagine that everybody just goes back to the way things were mm-hmm. 1st of March. And if you do just say, imagine everybody's going back to the way things are the 1st of March, the calculations get really scary quickly. Mm-hmm. Anyway, contact tracing. So we're going to fix this all by contact tracing, right, Allison?
Maybe not. Well, so, I guess, if anyone has seen even the government, recommendations or whatever, it's all, we can open back up as long as we have, contact tracing and all, and these other factors. Contact tracing and testing seem to be the two biggest things. The problem is that contact tracing, while in theory is great, again, you're dealing with people and how people react. So contact tracing, obviously aims to, say you have person A who is now tested positive, you want to go back through everyone they've interacted with for a certain period of time and let them know you should either get a test or self-quarantine, or, you have been at least exposed to this. And the reading that I was doing on it, says that obviously there's kind of two issues here. one, like I was saying, is it depends very heavily on people helping you. If you have to call someone and they need to pick up the phone, they need to be willing to listen to you. They need to be willing to tell you whether they were in, the same place. And then they need to actually be willing to self-quarantine or go get a test. So it kind of relies on, again, a lot of, people being willing to take these steps, which, again, a lot of people are, but some people aren't, or some people can't. Maybe they have a job where they really have to keep going in, or, a lot of the other issues that you have. And the other issue is that contact tracing isn't very effective in places where you're seeing a lot of new cases, because suddenly everything gets jumbled and you can't keep up with the flood of things. You either don't have enough contact tracers, or people are moving around too much. Or the system itself just, again, this is a very new system. We've never done this before, really. And it's a learning process for the people that are contact tracers, as well as the people that are being contacted by the contact tracers. So it's kind of just a lot of newness thrown at people all at once, and that complicates matters. And then I want to say that they looked at countries that did, I'm gonna have to pull it up, that did very quickly and effectively put contact tracing into place. And I want to say it was Iceland that they looked at, where, again, 40% of the population was being tracked, by a COVID-19 app. And they still had new cases and still had issues with this. So it's not the magic bullet that, again, everyone kind of wants to believe that it is. It's not useless, but it seems to be not the whole solution.
Yeah, I just want to, a very quick aside. We got a comment here. My company is projecting a return to the office for high-risk people in 2021. It sounds like when at their desk, no mask will be required. I'm hearing a lot of people talk about, well, here is what we are going to do months down the line. I think my response to that is people don't have the foggiest clue what they're going to do months down the line.
Well, they may know exactly what they're going to do, whether it makes any sense whatsoever. They have no clue about it.
Well, let me say it a little differently. People have no clue as to what the situation is going to be.
Right. That's right.
A few months down the line. And
people want to optimistically assume that the situation will be better months down the line.
Right. Based on zero evidence, though.
Right.
Yeah, we just wait
based on negative. I mean, it's not even based on zero evidence. It's based entirely on wishful thinking, because that's not what the evidence says.
Or again, it's based on we'll have a vaccine by then, so things will be better. Yes, they will, but still not a magic bullet. So I mean, actually, there was, go off tangent a little bit. There was something else I was reading, and I don't want to quote the statistic necessarily because I know I will get it wrong, but it was something like, again, say you need 80%, of people to have immunity to this, to have herd immunity. Well, only 70% of people are willing to get a vaccine, for example. Then what do you do? What do you do about the people that aren't willing to either get a vaccine from the government because they don't trust the government, or they don't trust vaccines, or then you're still going to have problems with this,
right.
They think that Bill Gates is trying to shoot little tracing machines in them.
And then especially if you need a multi-part vaccine, then you need people to go back for the second part. And
hey, what's the problem with that? Haven't you ever seen any sci-fi films?
Again, especially if it's, say, a multi-part, vaccine. Actually, I am only like 99% immune to measles because I had a very bad reaction to the first part of that vaccine when I was a baby, and so I never actually got the second part or whatever was required. So again, how much immunity does one dose confer? And obviously, there's nothing we can't answer that at all right now.
No, we have no
that
idea.
might be something we're gonna have to look at some point.
But I mean, what that means is that at some level, you are one of the people who,
I need everybody else to be immune,
relies on herd immunity.
Yeah, exactly.
And so the anti-vaxxers don't. Well, I don't know.
Yeah, but that's the
they don't understand that it's not just them that they're putting at risk.
Right.
It's you that they're putting.
And it's the same thing with wearing masks.
They don't understand, or they don't care.
Yeah. Or they don't believe. Again, if you don't believe that the vaccine is doing anything, then
well, but again, you may not believe in COVID, but COVID believes in you.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. That's the way that works.
Yep.
But yeah, it's the degree of public misunderstanding of this thing, I think, is one of the real travesties, because there was a while when we really did have everybody's attention around this business of COVID, and it was an opportunity to, honest to goodness, educate. And it was an opportunity that was completely blown, because certainly the bully pulpit was not being used to educate, and we're talking about, oh, it's a hoax and this, that, and the other thing. Just once you have politicized it in that way, then once people pick up their guns and go and march on the Capitol in Michigan or whatever, you're beyond the point that information is going to change anybody. And so we had a window when we might have actually gotten everybody on the same page and conveyed that information, and we completely threw that window away.
Yeah. Again, because if we just ignore it, it'll go away, right? So
because if we ignore it, it'll go away. Although another question is, there's starting to be some fairly serious efforts to suppress information about COVID. I was, my home state of Oklahoma, which is maybe a great place to be from, with a fairly strong emphasis on from, I hate to say it. You always know what time it is in Oklahoma. It's 1950. I shouldn't say that. I have a lot of very good friends in Oklahoma, and there are a lot of very good people there. But sort of politically, it has a way of being backwards, as few people can figure out how to be backwards politically. They've got an anti-vaxxer for a governor. I mean, how can you even do that? But, they were announcing that, we don't think it's necessary to provide COVID statistics anymore because everything's fine now and we've got the infrastructure and so on and so forth and so on and so forth. And nobody could possibly actually believe that. And, that's very clearly about, let's suppress the information. And it's okay if 20,000 people in Oklahoma die of COVID, but nobody knows about it, does Trump still win the election? Yeah, it's, I don't know. So all the things that we need going forward, we need good information, we need people to understand, all of that kind of stuff. We need a unified response. And none of that is happening. And we are losing, the nation as a whole made a lot of progress. The nation as a whole got to the point where R naught was one-ish. It was actually headed in a good direction. And we're throwing all of that away.
Right.
So anyway, public health responses, I don't know. That's
again,
what we were supposed to be talking about. Yeah. What can we say?
Again, it seems to be, it's kind of the trend with this is that everything's very individualized. Your response has to be your own, which for better or for worse, and again, that makes it more difficult for people who are very concerned or very vulnerable, because again, you go to the grocery store and you're relying on other people to wear masks to protect you because you need to go to the grocery store. And if they're not, that's out of your control. There's only so many steps you can take because again, the response has been left down essentially to the individual, which is very difficult.
Dave, I have a question for you as the historian of the gang here. I think that we are, I think, pretty clearly on a path where we are going to see, in maybe not even that distant future, more deaths from COVID in the United States than combat deaths in World War II. And in World War II, the nation stood on its head, doing things with people making sacrifices and for the common good. Can I put the current unwillingness to act in the common good in some kind of historical context, because I don't get it.
Well, it's funny as a parallel with World War II, because there was great division and a lack of cooperation and disagreement, and even, isolationist speeches made everywhere with enormous crowds, right up through what was the European War's beginning and first period. And no one wanted the United States to get involved at all, of course. And FDR going out on the high Atlantic, meeting Winston Churchill, who never held up a Bible in front of a church, by the way. But he truly,
because he was smart.
Awe-inspiring.
I think that his constituency would have recognized the irony as well.
In his time, Winston Churchill. But FDR, had to, pull an end around Congress in order to support Britain being at its knees against the Nazi war machine. And it was only on the morning of December 7th, 1941, when Pearl Harbor was attacked, and then Franklin Roosevelt made his joint address to Congress that virtually everyone in the nation listened to on radio, that isolationism and divisiveness and lack of unity dissipated instantaneously. And there was total unity, having been attacked, that we were all in this together, and that the survival of the nation was at stake, and that fascism was threatening to take over the world, and of course Japan and the Pacific as well. And as immediately the Axis powers all followed Japan by declaring war on the United States. So there was a complete and total unity, and all of that dissension and crazy political nonsense on the fringe and conspiring to not help out our longest allies in the world politically was gone. And now we're being attacked, interestingly enough, also by a foe that is threatening to take our national interests away, and we're not unified. So it's very, I don't know what the answer to that. It's an invisible foe that some people don't even believe exists, I think. And they don't understand the interstices of how to protect themselves or others from it. But I don't know why things are different. And that spirit of what we call the greatest generation standing up, and for 6 years, for the better part of, for 4 years, essentially, for us fighting an all-out war all around the globe, happened the way it did then, with that total unity and sacrifice of essentially everything that was at stake and available, and why we don't have that spirit in maybe the not so greatest generation, our generation, and so on now. I can't explain that, because in some ways we're under just as much threat now as we were with something like a shooting war.
I think because maybe getting shot is something that people can understand, whereas breathing in a virus is much less realistic for them. I mean, I kind of want to take the easy way out and say leadership is the difference, which I think it is a difference, but again, I think it's a different type of threat.
It certainly is.
Well, I mean,
maybe that's harder for people to grasp. I don't know.
Yeah. Certainly the images that came out of Pearl Harbor were very...
I mean, you can't knock those. There's...
You can't unsee things like that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I have wondered, for privacy reasons, it is very uncommon to actually see, here is a person who is in the process of dying of COVID. Or here is what it looks like. They'll show you, here is the hallway in the COVID ward, but they won't actually show you, here's what's going on inside of those rooms.
So it's still kind of an invisible.
I appreciate the privacy issues, but by the same token, you kind of think that maybe it ought to be impossible to turn on a news program without seeing footage of what it actually looks like to die from this thing.
For those who are interested, there was a Frontline, the PBS television show about three or 4 weeks ago now, that was an inside hospitals in Italy.
Yeah, I saw that.
Right, yeah.
So that, I think, can be seen streaming online for anyone who has PBS. That was really as close as I think as you can get to a behind the scenes look at how grisly this disease really is.
Yeah. Actually, go back again, a step back here. We've got a comment talking about somebody who actually took the contact tracing course and makes an interesting comment. Says that contact tracing is almost an unfair name for what they're training people for. There's lots of tracing, but half the training is really more for something you'd call an isolation support specialist. That actually kind of makes sense. I mean, I understand, yeah. And I'll be honest, I look at the numbers, and are you going to really contact trace? And are you going to contact trace, especially in the face of asymptomatic carriers? And if you want to contact trace, you're going to get serious and start saying, all right, we're going to put apps on everybody's phone, and we're just going to be able to tell you, have you been close to someone who is a known carrier in the last week? But the isolation support specialist is not crazy. Actually helping people. How is it that you manage to remain locked down and safe and all of that kind of stuff? And having somebody bring food and groceries and all of that kind of stuff for you.
Yeah, because when you need to isolate, and you can't have people being like, well, I will isolate except for that time that I need to go to the grocery store, or because again, I live alone, for example, and if I needed to isolate, I would have to basically have my groceries delivered or have someone come do it for me. I don't have a family member to do it.
Yeah. And I mean, we don't really know about immunity, whether having the disease conveys immunity yet or not, but they're just obvious things like, damn it, we should be finding people who at least have had the disease, and then saying, all right, there are things like delivering groceries, and there are things like, that are things.
Of course, it takes like 8 weeks to actually get over it. So if you have the disease, it's going to be a long time before you feel up to going to work again.
That's true. That is true.
Yeah,
that is true.
But yeah, I mean, that would be, again, the ideal situation is, people that have had it could kind of step up in this case and say, yes, I can, deliver groceries or fill this essential role because, and again, I mean, I think everything that they're finding does seem to indicate, again, that it, seems to convey immunity as far as we can tell. So, again, that may be optimistic thinking, but I feel like we should at least operate on that assumption because it's a pretty reasonable assumption to make until proven otherwise.
At least some, everybody seems to think that there will at least be some immunity for some amount of time.
Exactly.
Which means that certainly if you've had it, you are safer both for yourself and others than someone who hasn't. But,
right. And again, even with, contact tracing, I think, to me, again, you just kind of look at the situation from the outside and you say, well, we need, thousands of contact tracers. Well, there are suddenly thousands of people who are out of jobs. Why is this so hard to connect? And I mean, obviously it's not simple. And that's kind of the same thing with that. You've got people, you do have people that have had it, and you do have roles that need to be filled, and maybe
but you have to pay for it. And granted, billionaires have made something like $400 billion windfall off the pandemic so far, and so you wouldn't think it would be hard to say, there's some sources of wealth that could be tapped to pay for those kinds of things. Although in the current political climate, the idea of actually taxing something like that is unthinkable. That's another thing that's changed. I remember back in the day, the oil crisis, when OPEC shut down oil deliveries to the United States, essentially, and oil companies made a huge profit. There was a windfall profit tax, by golly. Where's the windfall profits tax right? You know, even set aside wealth taxes, which are something that we should really be talking about. Where's the windfall profit tax on this thing, for crying out loud? Lord knows we need it. Yeah. Nobody has an answer for that one. Okay. All right.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So after we solve the problem of systemic racism in police departments, we can go after economic inequality, right?
Yeah. One thing per month here.
Yeah. One thing per month. We can't do that many things at once. One crisis at a time.
Although I'll tell you what, those same groups of people who are getting together to join hands across a lot of traditional lines and say, all right, here is common cause, and we're gonna fight this thing together. Wealth inequality would be a good thing for that group to then turn their attention to.
They'll get to it. This youngest generation has reached a breaking point.
Mm-hmm.
I hope you're right.
I think, yeah.
Is it a breaking point that's going to show up in the polls? And that's another matter. Okay, so back again. Damn it. We promised that we were going to talk about public health stuff. So
I'm about 5 minutes to do it. So
kicking and screaming, I'm going to drag us back in that direction.
Everything is public health at this point. So.
Everything. That's true. Everything is public health at that point. What have we not talked? I mean, the tools that we've got, we've talked about mobility. And what's going on there, and the fact that we actually can monitor it, and people are getting awful again. People talk about contact tracing, and that's just kind of a crazy thing to rely on. Testing. What's going on with testing?
I feel like I don't know, because we haven't heard anything about it.
Yeah,
there's been nothing on it.
I mean, testing was going up, and I get the sense that there's, at least in a lot of places that need it, it's coming back down again.
Again, I think the problem behind it with supplies never got solved because certain people kept saying it's fine, and it was never fine, but they never put any effort into actually solving that problem. So to my understanding, I haven't heard anything about it, so I'm assuming it's not better.
You don't have to say some people. I think that among us, we have crossed the Rubicon of being able to name names about this kind of stuff.
Yeah, but I mean, again, I have not heard a peep on any improvements in testing. I mean, I assume it's not getting worse, but I definitely haven't heard anything about it getting better. So
I think it's in part a victim of this, the federal government washing its hands of the problem. And, we went through this beginning in April 1861, of thinking that maybe all the states can unilaterally do something independently all at once, more efficiently than a central national government. Didn't work out too well for the Confederates that way. So
no.
So the problem, the federal government of the United States basically throwing its hands up and saying it's the state's problem has made it just a hellish mess, I think, is my impression.
Well, I wonder, I mean, we're talking about, hopefully, I figure either a lot of this changes come January 21st or the world has come to an end anyway, and, cash it in. I'm not sure what to do at that point. I've thought about becoming an expatriate, except I don't know who takes us these days.
I was going to say, no one would let you in.
It's now out of pity, however.
Yeah.
But I mean, in the meantime, you start wondering, you mentioned the Confederacy. How about a 50-state confederacy to get together and try to figure out what the hell people are going to do about COVID?
That would be more efficient than a centralized force using the most expert people who exist.
Oh, no. I'm not talking about from an efficiency standpoint. The right thing to do would be to actually have leadership in Washington and to do what it is. I mean, providing, if this is not providing for the common defense, I don't know what would be considered providing for the common defense.
Right.
Quite thank you. But no, if that's not going to happen, and that's not going to happen, then there has been a certain amount of governors getting together and saying, okay, in our little region, we're going to do this together and we're going to do that together.
Mm-hmm. Well, the more coordination that can happen, the better, certainly, given the circumstance. Yeah.
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 In fact, for a while there, people were starting to talk about California, Oregon, and Washington. What was the name that they were referring to
as an
that
independent republic? You mean?
What's that?
As an independent republic?
Yeah, I mean, it was talking about it in the context of COVID, but it wasn't a big jump to go from there to say, yeah, let's just call it Oregonia or something like that. And because as people have pointed out, that if California were to cut itself off, it would be one of the, I forget, 14th largest economy in the world or something like that.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't know too, when you look at COVID, if you look at a map of where the hotspots are, which is something that people might find interesting to do. There are various places you can find those maps. New York Times is one of them. If you go to any COVID story in the Times and click, and then up at the top, there'll be a list of places where you can go and look at current maps and so on and so forth. But if you look at the current map of the United States, where the hotspots are, the Southeast is just on fire.
And unfortunately for the Southeast, the population of the Southeast has an enormous number of predisposed health conditions that will make many of the cases especially bad, unfortunately.
And also, I mean, it's hitting, back to the earlier conversation, for all sorts of reasons. Mm-hmm. In that area especially, it is hitting the Black and other minority communities hardest, largely because the socioeconomics are such that a larger fraction of those communities don't have the luxury of working at home. Mm-hmm. Don't have the luxury of being able to, you talk about white privilege.
Yeah.
The fact that the three of us can sit here and work from home and do okay and do things like that, instead of having, if we're going to put food on the table, to get out and mix it up with everybody else, that's a real thing. But again, you look at the South, and the South is just on fire with this stuff.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's horrible. But maybe a whole bunch of people are going to decide that they really do need to get politically active, not only because of what's going on with George Floyd and what's followed from that, but also with the realization that they're getting the short end of the COVID stick as well.
Well, let's hope that all these things can teach us to make a better world, and that we have just a little bit better world, we hope, next week. And I think we're going to talk again a week from today, right?
I think so. Is that what we decided, Allison?
Yeah, I think we decided Thursdays are going to be our new.
Yeah.
We will not be on Monday, but we will be live again a week from today, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
I think that's what we're going to do. And I will change the webpage accordingly and all of that kind of good stuff. So to our small handful of devoted listeners out there, handful of devoted listeners out there, you're gonna get us one day a week instead of two, which means that you just have to you'll be that much more anxious to hear us when the time comes along. Although, I mean, it's we have to do it that way. This thing takes more prep than people would imagine it ought to, and we have things that we have to do with our lives. But by the flip side of it is, Jesus, from Monday to today, we damn near find ourselves in martial law. I mean,
it'll be interesting to see where we're at next week.
It'll be interesting to see where we're at a week from now. Indeed, it will.
No lack of things to talk about, I'm sure, by then.
Lack indeed. All right. Well, see you guys next week, and I'm sure we will be in touch before then, and good luck getting that the issue of the magazine out. Now that I have done, I mean, you have my column now, so you're all set to go.
We're done.
That's right. Yeah.
All right. Take care, everybody.
Talk soon.
Okay.